Hello, I'm Connor Prendergast, and welcome to episode 14 of Support Stacked. So, Thomas Hils, head of support for Wingspan, how are you today?
I'm doing quite well. Very excited to be here and to show off some of what I built.
Excellent. So this is our second episode with you. We are talking today, though, about how you were forever AI pilled from the very start. You were obsessed with AI, and you were like, "Yes, this is the best thing since sliced bread."
Yeah, I have been a hard AI skeptic for years in the support context. I used to joke that like it'll come for engineers' jobs before it comes for customer support. I don't think I was wrong on the framing. I just didn't quite understand how quickly it would become useful and applicable to complex products, which is kind of my bread and butter support for these kind of technical or otherwise like very investigative heavy tools. And now, every 6 months, every 2 weeks, I have to reevaluate how AI can be helpful. And we've kind of hit this tipping point, and now it's in everything that I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Last episode, episode 13, we talked about how you use Claude Cowork as a part of your QA process to review conversations. But today is a slight twist on that as well. Set the scene for us. Wingspan has a long history of extremely well-documented processes that you have never had to fill in the blanks on. Is that right?
We've had ups and downs with our process documentation, largely and very honestly, as many, I think, small startups will find, your documentation, even when you have a best effort, is just lacking. And for us, one of the kind of pivotal moments is we went through a banking transition because we are a payroll company back in the summer of 2024, where everything we previously knew about the tool and how to support it changed. We had a hard refresh. And due to some of the timing of that, we had to kind of figure it out as we went along. And the result of that was not good documentation. Largely, what we did end up making was quickly outdated, or it wasn't thorough. And for the folks on the team who were kind of experienced, had been there for a while, it was doable. But as we started adding new people to the team, it was very, very clear to us that this was not sufficient. And we needed to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, so we referenced this in the last episode, in episode 13, where one of the things you're looking for in QA and conversations is compliance, because it is utterly critical. And from my experience of working at Expensify, we were also dealing with bank transactions, ACH transfers, credit cards set up, all very high risk if you don't get it right. And working through those compliance processes is absolutely critical. But before you can work through compliance processes, you have to have the compliance processes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great that, at companies like this, we all go through these compliance trainings through whatever third-party company we've contracted with. And I think that, of course, those are helpful and they give you context, but it's important that you're able to adapt them to the on-the-ground experience that folks are having in support. And then be clear. There's not a lot of room for ambiguity when it comes to these kind of compliance risks. And so that was one of the first places we were most doubling down on, making sure that process documentation exists and that it is applicable.
Yes. And so I'm curious, what came first? Was it, did you think of building on top of the existing QA process to improve your processes, your written processes? Or was it the other way around? Were you first trying to improve process documentation first and then got into QA afterwards?
They were happening simultaneously, but the realization was that these are the same problem there. It's part of a similar cycle. And so I combined them pretty early on after getting some pretty poor results from the QA process without this context. And then what occurred to me quite quickly is, wow, what we do have is very limited, and you can't do QA this way without having these really detailed docs.
Of course, because you might intuitively know that someone has followed the right process, but that doesn't work effectively if you are trying to get anyone else, including an LLM like Claude or Claude Cowork, to do those QA processes. They can't follow what's not documented. And it's very similar. I said this the last episode. It's very similar to Finn and Finn's content. Finn cannot give content that doesn't exist. Finn cannot share information that doesn't exist. So you have to start there.
Yeah, and it's very surprising how much of, like, I think what we create in traditional documentation, it does require an element of context that isn't actually written down anywhere. There's these connections between A and B that people assume that an AI can.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And often if an AI is inferring connections, it ends up inferring the wrong ones. So let's just
Absolutely.
avoid that entirely and just document the process why well instead. You ended up, so you added it on as part of your QA framework. Maybe if someone hasn't seen, again, I'll call back the last episode. If you haven't seen episode 13, go back, take a look at what Thomas was showing us last time. Why don't we dive in and see what it actually does? So as a like, what's the one sentence for the background for how this works?
Yeah, 1 second sentence is tough, but I'll make it work.
Fine, you can go too if you want.
What it does is it takes real conversations and compares that conversation and what happened in it to a existing database of processes, and it will identify gaps either in a existing doc for this situation or whether a doc exists to handle this type of situation, and then
Great.
generate one if it doesn't find it.
Perfect. I think that was 2 sentences. Okay, so you're going to show us how this works in Claude Cowork, and just like with the QA, it is using Claude Cowork. It's using the Intercom MCP, which is a type of connection between computers, we'll say, and you've got the skills built into Claude Cowork that goes through this whole process.
So in this case, it's pulling a specific ticket. Although
Mm-hmm.
it can run this, just grab 5 tickets and check. That's
Yeah.
how I've been trying to get like more broad coverage. And then it's going to read the conversation, summarize it to itself, then try to get an understanding of the product using our product knowledge base. Like what is being asked for here? What are these elements of the product? And then it's going to go ahead and compare that to our existing process documentation. So most of this documentation, what we actually did is we fed it all of this context of existing documentation that we had for our internal support team and some very clear kind of decision tree logic that we had created for a BPO team, which I think is probably the more useful part of this context training, to be perfectly honest. And then gave it this prompt like, hey, these are documents we want you to be able to reference when doing ticket QA and when doing this kind of process generation work. So structure it for that. And so that's the bulk of what it is looking at now to see if existing documentation exists. And that is the end result of what it would generate, either an update to one of those or a brand new doc that does that. So here it's kind of identified the ticket and the core issue that someone was having. And it's identified that there's a missing process. So that's like A is there's no doc at all. B is something is not quite covered. Or I might have
Oh,
that flipped, so
interesting.
bear with me. So there is no troubleshooting doc for this thing. Invoice content questions. So what in the invoice someone from our product has received? What do they do about it? It's got some kind of references to existing docs, but those don't actually cover it. And so this is something I like, that it doesn't just stop at one source. It likes to
Yeah.
crawl through everything because stuff is spread out in a way that it understands and speaks to the different ways that these processes might touch each other. So it's this web. And now it's kind of offering what it thinks we should do. So in this case, a new doc with a specific title and what it should cover, how it should go through that decision tree, diagnostic steps. What I think is kind of interesting about how we landed on these docs is because they're ultimately written for the AI, where the expectation is that while the humans do interact with them, they interact with them through this kind of interface, through Claude. So that means that the docs can be structured very strangely to a human, but very clearly to the AI. So it'll include things like suggested responses, it can include decision trees, and then also these kind of cross-document references. So one of the more
Mm-hmm.
important parts of this process for us is that all of these process docs carry a list of product areas and product features that tie to docs elsewhere in our kind of database that are AI definitions of those products and features. And this is kind of an advanced step, but our docs will watch for changes in those products and feature docs, and then assess whether or not the changes that happen there impact this process. Our goal is to get to this much more fully AI driven process. That is a long term goal. But just out of the gate, being able to take a conversation, look at your existing content, whether that's written for AI or not, and determine whether this question could be answered by that content, I think is super powerful. And then, of course, getting this out. And it even talks through why it thinks this suggestion matters, what's not being covered, whether that uh, led to a bad answer, or whether a human had to have known this to generate the answer that it gave.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So what's really interesting about this is that Finn is involved and the teammates are involved. Um, and just to make it, what after you create this process, is this something that Finn accesses as well, or is it just for teammates?
So right now it's just for teammates, but there is of
Mm.
course another process I've built where
Of
this.
course, you're running another project.
Yes, it's there's a lot of things looping together here, but these changes to that process documentation, I do run checks against them and are compare that to our Fin content, which we've
Yeah,
got downloaded in local, and it'll suggest improvements there. So this is like a connector step for us between like our internal AI resources, which we're very lucky at Wingspan to have many built out, and connecting that then ultimately to these customer facing resources. It saves me, quite frankly, a considerable amount of time versus me getting, a product change and then having to manually go through and understand how that would impact that existing guidance or content there.
yeah. So have you? I'm just curious. Have you got to the point where you have found these sort of processes and thought, actually, this is something that Finn should just handle? Have Has anything spun up from that to say, like, okay, well, let me turn this into a either something simple like an internal article or something more complex like a procedure?
Yeah, so we've an outcome of this has been quite a few new or updated articles to be put into Fin, whether they are external facing or internal. We have
Yeah,
this skill that assesses which piece of Fin content is right for the context that the bot suggests here. Again, there's layers of complexity here that I've built that actually aren't required, but this
yeah,
is just how I think in systems. And I think that's been really good. I think our Fin often trailed in content that the team would know, but Fin wouldn't. We're all spread thin. We're all trying to do our best to keep all of the different plates spinning. And this has made it a lot easier to get content very quickly into Fin and identify where we've got gaps.
yeah. Excellent. Okay, so that's really interesting. And so you include this as part of your QA process now. It or it runs naturally every day and picks up conversation.
Yeah.
It compares them to your processes, which you've done a really good job. It sounds like you and your CTO have done a really good job of defining processes, writing them down somewhere that Claude Code can access them, which is the really important part. And then it suggests gaps in those processes and even goes so far as drafting the changes that Claude Code should make.
Yeah, it queues it up, and frankly, it's gotten quite good at the suggestions. Whether that's because it's learning from the human resolution to the ticket. So if it's pulling a ticket where a human has done the thing,
Yeah.
it'll raise to me, was this right? If it doesn't have the level of confidence it needs to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And if it is, the documentation it typically produces is quite accurate to the process that we are doing. Very rarely do I have to tweak it. I think that happened a lot more earlier on when we first started generating these things, but I think that
Yeah.
was a result of just how much content was missing.
Yeah, of course. Does this rely mostly on internal notes that your team are leaving on conversations to show their work?
Yes, so that was a tricky piece. Not every time when someone resolves a ticket do they clearly articulate what they've done.
Yeah, of
So
course.
where possible, it's looking at notes on the ticket. What it does a great job of is integrating also with linear, which is how we handle our escalations. And so what we had documented pretty well was like a lot of very basic stuff where there wasn't much diagnostics that happen, or those diagnostics were pretty clearly defined.
Hmm.
And where that isn't the case often does result in a escalation, because we do, financial operations and compliance operations. We create a lot of
Yeah.
escalations to those particular teams, and that helps feed so much context to it, because the end of the process is often create the escalation, and part of the work is described in that linear ticket, because a good escalation in my mind walks through the exact problem a customer's happening, what you tried to do to resolve that problem, and where there's that gap. And that is a perfect training model for this type of process documentation generation.
Yeah. Okay, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought about the linear aspect of it as well, because there are probably situations where it gets to linear, and maybe there are engineering fixes that have to happen to resolve an issue. So it's not a process gap, but it's a bug, or it's something that you haven't encountered before. But certainly a lot of the time it will be the fact that Finn and the teammate didn't understand the process, or didn't know the process, or it hadn't been documented. And that is a key way of speeding up that resolution for a customer, by writing down that process clearly for the teammate to tackle it without having to go through the escalation process later.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a lot of success just being able to so I built a version of this for my agents now. When they're solving tickets, they can ask for help. Essentially, it's just the QA process, but a little bit adapted to not spit out a score, but to spit out these steps, and also give feedback on the suggested steps as well. So what we've really just tried to do is create as many inputs as possible, and like kind of areas of correction, whether that's me going over the suggested doc with
Hmm.
Claude, or it's someone on the team asking for help on a ticket and then being like, oh no, that's obviously not what we do, and we can
Mm.
adapt that. And I think where folks sometimes get frustrated is that their early versions of this are quite bad, and it
Yeah.
feels like you're never going to make it better. But there is kind of like this tipping point of context where suddenly it just knows enough to fill in blanks, although we got to get rid of those blanks. But it can understand the general motions of what your team does. And
Yeah.
you end up with kind of a virtuous cycle, right? That's the term.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you found, because I know that there's a risk of not having enough context. I always feel like there's a risk of having too much as well. So these LLMs do have their context windows, and if you exceed it, then suddenly it just kind of all falls apart. I don't know if you found this, but certainly with a client with Fin tasks, there was one point where I discovered that Fin tasks had a limit of 250 examples of trigger this task, and 250 examples of do not trigger this task, and it wasn't documented anywhere. But it's just that I hit that, and I wasn't able to add any more, and at the same time very quickly realized that having 250 examples is considerably worse than having 30 examples of each. So I like, all of a sudden that task in particular was false positiving. It was just firing all the time for totally unrelated things. So that was an example of me giving too much context, and it was just totally overwhelming poor Finn. Have you found that there's some things that you have to give it slightly less access to, or a lot less access to, rather than the whole of Notion, for example, for a particular skill?
Yes. So what we do is kind of have very specific restrictions when it comes to a step in the skill. So
Okay.
there's a step that might look at the have a very it's called knowledge base, which is just a silly way to do this, but there is a specific knowledge base with all of this AI context. That's actually separate from the process documentation as well. So you're
Mm.
kind of like trying to rein in the context there, and they can also inform each other. So it might look at the product knowledge so that it makes sure it understands what's being said in here and how those things work, and then kind of distill that down for what it should search for then in the process documentation. And I think that's especially useful when taking kind of customer language, or the way that a customer
Hmm.
might describe a problem, and then matching that up against the content that how you describe it. That's could be very different. I know you had a great episode about
I was
teaching Finn that, and I applied that here. It was perfect.
Oh, perfect. For viewer, that's Gabriella's episode 11. So I'll put a link up just there. And that's exactly creating a glossary for Finn to understand customer language. So it was an internal article. I'm really glad. That's a really great way of applying it into a different scenario as well. That's great. Oh, how interesting. So, okay. So what would you recommend as a good starting point for someone who maybe they're a little bit confident in Claude and Claude Cowork, they've got the Intercom MCP set up? Like, what's the starting point for getting this continuous virtuous cycle of improvement, of process improvement and documentation written
Yeah,
down?
absolutely. It's an easy start. I think the first and foremost is feeding what you have for your internal team, whatever documentation that might be, into Claude, and give it that kind of explicit instructions or expectations up front. I've heard people refer to how you should instruct Claude as what you would tell to a new hire, and I think that's
Mm,
especially true right at the start of this. So this is what we are aiming to do. So in this case, hey, I'm looking to set up a process that make sure that we have documentation for customer support tickets. And I want your help with that. The outcome should be, X, Y, and Z, and then feed it that context. And here's the docs that we have for our internal team. It might be helpful to tell it a little bit about the quality of your docs. So, an accurate assessment if you feel comfortable telling the truth to Claude, like, hey, we know we're missing content, or hey, we think this is exhaustive. That might give it some kind of scoping to this particular problem. And I think it's important then to do one big step, which is ask Claude to format that content in a way that is accessible to AI. You need to give it
mm,
that explicit instruction, because like we talked about with the context windows, the way that a human needs to read things is very different, and we can condense a lot when we give it that explicit expectation that only an AI is going to read this. And then from there, ask it to pull 5 Intercom tickets and see if those processes are covered, and iterate, keep doing that. And very quickly, you find both the gaps in your documentation, but also are on the path to plugging those gaps so fast. And my extra recommendation is then set a scheduled task. Every morning I wake up, I sit down on my computer. There are 10 tickets reviewed for process gaps and suggestions for you to do them. And then I go through the 70 other scheduled Claude tasks I have, and the workday's over. But that is all these behaviors we used to have to teach ourselves to do for good documentation and good process. We can automate some element of this. And I think that's really great.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, listen, Thomas, this has been fascinating once again. I was really hopeful that this would be a concrete, applicable episode, and it really is. Like, I think, especially in us when we're working in smaller organizations, it can be very tempting to just sort of glaze over the documentation a little bit. But I think this is a great way of getting those clear steps written down, so that when you hire your next hire, or when you're transferring stuff for Finn to do it, you make my job easier.
Absolutely.
Super. Okay, Thomas. Is there a particular destination where you'd like us to visit you?
Yes, you can find me online at my personal website, thomas.town. And there will be all of the contact details and anything else you want to know about me.
Excellent. Well, and dear viewer, if you enjoyed this episode, please feed my ravenous ego by pressing the subscribe button and by pressing the like button and sharing it with all of your closest friends and family members. And you can get daily emails from me about Intercom and Finn by going to customersuccess.cx/daily. And by daily, I mean week daily. Or you can do /week daily if you really want. But I will be back for a future episode of Support Stack. Until then, have a wonderful week, month, year, whatever you want to have. And thank you very much, Thomas, again. And toodaloos and goodbye, everyone.